our speaker here, now that everyone can hear me clearly. He's at Meta, he's at University of Southern California, where he both develops and applies new methods that involve text analysis, image analysis, network analysis, to try to extract meaning from largely social media data, and understanding its effects on various aspects of political systems around the world. Prior, he got his PhD at NYU, as well as completing a postdoc. And I think I'm just gonna leave it at that and let you
Awesome.
Take it from there.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Thank you so much for inviting me to share my work here. I'm very excited to be able to present this project that I've spent the last 3 years working on, the US 2020 Facebook and Instagram election study, which is a project that we launched in 2020 to understand the impact that these platforms are having in the political process in the US. And before I begin, I should start by saying that I might be presenting here, but I'm representing a very big team of both academic researchers, including one of your colleagues here, as well as researchers within the company. So I'm one of the researchers at Meta that has been executing some of the research that I'm about to present. And it was both a large team of researchers and also a large team of data scientists and experts in privacy and a lot of lawyers within Meta that also contributed to this project to make sure that we were able to do it the right way. So the project that I will present today, we had the big milestone just a couple of months ago, which is the first release, the first batch of papers that came out simultaneously in Science and Nature towards the end of July. So today I'll be talking about some of the results of this research and some of the project more generally, some of the other papers that we're working on. This was a release that was described by the New York Times as the social science equivalent of Barbenheimer weekend, which is probably the biggest compliment I will ever receive in my career. So we're very proud of this, but there's still a lot of more work to do. So today what I will talk about is, one, I'll give you an overview of the project, how we structure this collaboration, which I think is pretty novel, and I think is perhaps something that could inspire other collaborations between academic and industry researchers in the future. I will also talk about the data that we collected for this project, some of which is already available through ICPSR to replicate that research and also extend it to new studies that will focus on election and politics, and even if it's not directly related to the study that we did. So this is available to academic researchers already. So that's why I want to talk about that. And then I will give an overview of 2 of the experiments that we ran and that were just published a couple of months ago, and kind of what we learned from those results. Okay, so starting with the project. So as I mentioned earlier, this is a project that we launched to study Facebook and Instagram's election in the impact in the 2020 US election in a way that can leverage these many opportunities for collaboration that exist between researchers within companies and also in academia. And we try to address 2 challenges that research within this area can face. One is there's a lot of need for research that examines how social media platforms are affecting the political process. I think this is widely recognized in academia and policy circles and also within companies. So a lot of companies, including Meta, conducts a lot of research on these topics. But of course, if we were to publish that research that is being done by internal researchers within the company, those results would be received with a lot of, I think, very understandable skepticism from different audiences. So how can we conduct and disseminate the research in a way that can address some of these claims about potential issues? On the flip side is that completely independent academic researchers faces legal challenges in accessing individual level data, and also it's difficult sometimes to experimentally manipulate platform features in a way that would allow you to answer key questions that you care about. Say, what is the impact of feed ranking algorithm? That's very hard to do unless you're kind of working from the inside of these companies as well, have the capacity to alter these algorithms. So this sort of purely independent research in the current legal environment, in some cases, is not feasible. So we try to address this. And the way we address this is by spending a lot of time at the, the design table, trying to think okay, how can we do this in a way that can ensure the integrity of this study? So what are the things that we did, which I hope other future collaborations can do as well? First, we pre-register everything. So we pre-register 16 different studies, which means, prior to collecting any data or launching the experiments, we developed these very detailed pre-analysis plans detailing all the data we were going to collect, exactly the experiments that we were going to run, and how we would analyze the results of those experiments. And now we're just like executing on those pre-analysis plans. So, you can go back and check, like, are we doing what we said that we would do? Two, this was like purely collaborative project in which both meta researchers and academic research collaborated on the design of the experiments, on the analysis of the data, and also on the writing of the papers. But one important thing that we did was we gave the lead authors on the academic side for each of the papers control rights. So what this means is that they had control of the pen and the pencil, right, or like the keyboard in the computer on the final text of the papers, like the final decisions on pretty much everything here, right? So just to make sure that any potential concerns about Meta trying to, like the company trying to meddle with the studies, so this would address some of that. And then in case there were any disagreements at the end, any co-author in the project, academic or on the Meta side, could simply remove their name from their papers and like, oh, I disagree with this, or maybe not even saying it publicly, but just like withdraw like your name from the paper. Like so far from the Meta side, like no one has withdrawn their name from any of these papers. Third, I think like this is quite important. We were able to ensure that Meta as a company would not have pre-publication approval on the findings. So to be clear, the company could, if there were like legal reasons for like some of like the designs not being able to do it legally, or if there were privacy concerns, like the company could say, hey, like we won't be able to release this data. And whenever that happened, it just happened once. This is detailed in the study. But the company had no right to say, if the company didn't like the results of the papers and like, no, we don't want to publish this paper, right? So they didn't have the right to do it. I think this is obviously important because no matter what we find, good or bad, like that's what you're reading, that's what I'm about to present today. Fourth, we obtain IRB approval for everything. And then for any analysis that involved user level data, we also collected informed consent from the participants in the study. Yeah?
Yeah, but besides the fact that they would not have any pre-publication approval, did they have access to your study throughout the process?
That's a very good question. No. So obviously the researchers and the legal people that were reviewing the papers like had access, but company executives, product teams did not have access to the papers. They had access to the papers only 30 days prior to publication. And all of this was like, and also like the other thing is, the results of the papers were also not disseminated externally until the papers were published. So internal people or external people other than those involved in the project did not have access. We did this to preserve the integrity of the project because we didn't want the results to be disseminated until they have gone through peer review as well, right? So that was thank you for asking that. That's also pretty important as well for the design of the project. We implemented something that I think was also quite novel about this study is that we implemented a system of code review for all the pipeline code and for all the analysis code. What this means is that every single line of code that we wrote had to be reviewed by at least one researcher within the company and one researcher on the academic side as well, so in order to ensure that we could agree on how we were analyzing the data. There was a rapporteur for the overall project, so Michael Wagner, who's a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So this was a person that had access to everything within the project, came to our meetings, we Zoom off in the background. Sometimes we forget that he was here in the meetings. And then afterwards, he wrote a piece that came out with Science, where he described how the process worked and some suggestions, things that didn't work as well, things that were a success. And also he confirmed that the whole process was like as designed and like the results are trustworthy. And it's like legitimate science. So you can read the piece as well. I will not talk about this because it's his work. But I believe like after the whole project is completed, he will also discuss more how this worked. And the final thing, as I mentioned, is that we are releasing all the data through ICPSR using a clean room environment. So what this means is that you can apply for access through ICPSR. This is only for researchers with an IRB approved project or those who want to replicate their published papers. And then you can connect to like their server. There's like some like security measures because this is obviously very sensitive data, particularly the user level data. And then you can already request access. You can, I think this is called the SOMAR archive at ICPSR. So that's already available. And, there's a lot of code books and detailed information on the ICPSR website that talks a lot, that details what the data is available with more at length. Okay, so let me talk about the research itself. As I mentioned earlier, we want to understand how Facebook and Instagram affects the election. Of all the things we could explore, we decided to focus on 4 main variables of interest, and these were selected by the academic researchers. We studied the effect of these platforms on misinformation and like knowledge, on polarization, on political participation, and then attitudes and beliefs about democratic norms, which obviously became particularly important in this election after the January 6 events. So all the papers in the project study in some way, like what is the relationship between usage of these platforms and at least one of these 4 outcomes of interest. And within the project, we have 2 big categories of studies. One is a sort of experiments that we run. The second is observational studies where we analyze existing data. These are like more like descriptive in nature. In terms of the experiments that we run at the activation study. So we incentivize a random subset of people on either Facebook or Instagram to stop using these platforms in the weeks leading up to the election. It's a design of an experiment that had been done before by our collaborators in other contexts. It has been explored also in other countries as well. We did this in 2020 as well, and this is trying to get like what is the overall impact of using these platforms on vote choice, polarization, things like that. And then we also have a set of platform interventions that focus more narrowly on specific features within the platforms that may affect people's attitudes and behaviors. So these are more like tailored towards a specific mechanism. So today I'll talk about 2 of these. So one is an experiment where we displayed content in chronologically reverse order. Another one where we demoted content from politically like-minded sources. But we also had experiments that excluded political ads, where we reduce exposure to untrustworthy sources, so trying to look at the impact of exposure to misinformation, and another one that was published already looking at exposure to research content. Within the observational studies, we have also 2 types of papers that we're working on. One are papers that look at specifically at respondent level, the respondent level data that we collected, examining things like exposure to political ads, like anti-normative content, so this would be hate speech, things like that. And then one paper that looks specifically at beliefs and attitudes related to election confidence, and we'll look at the effect of January 6 events and things like that. And then there's a bunch of other papers that look at aggregated data for all Facebook or Instagram users during the election study. For this, we don't study respondent level data, we just look at aggregate data. And some of the topics that we explore here are one study looking at segregation in news consumption that was public, another one that is looking at how misinformation spreads, which is currently under review, another one that looks at the political advertising landscape. Okay, so at the core of the project, we have this participant panel, which is like the main data set that we're analyzing in pretty much all of these studies. So this was a 6-wave panel survey. You have the timing here, and this is the 2 main experiments that we run, the deactivation and then some of these platform interventions. These are participants that we recruited on platform, or Facebook and Instagram. A pretty large, comparatively, compared to other election studies, a pretty large sample. In the end, we ended up with something in the order of like 140,000 participants. And these were people that were recruited on platform. And then we partnered with NORC, which is a survey research institution that is affiliated with the University of Chicago, to help us manage and like administer all these surveys, right? And this is, in case you're curious, this is how we recruited people. Something in the order of 50 million users on Facebook, across Facebook and Instagram saw this, so maybe some of you in this room may have seen this. We gave them a lot of information, and all of this was approved by our IRB. In terms of like what the study would consist on, participants could withdraw at any time for any reason, which also meant like we had to implement this whole process to deal with withdrawals, which did happen, and then we had to then go back and delete their data, things like that. And this happened until we fully de-identified the data earlier this year before we published the study. So from now on, like participants cannot withdraw, but also we don't have any identifiable data anymore. And happy to talk more about the details of how we make this happen later. One thing that I would add that it turned out to be quite useful is we partnered with an external and independent research ethics firm called Ethical Resolved that helped us deal with some of like the tricky ethical issues that we faced here in terms of how we recruit this set of people, how do we design the studies, the experiments in a way that can be ethical and things like that. Okay, I have a lot more details in this presentation about like statistical, how we ensure that we were sufficiently powered to identify meaningful effects, how we, recruited these people in this sampling frame, things like that. I'm going to skip most of this, but happy to return during Q&A if you're interested, because these are the sort of things that are buried in the appendix, but we spent months thinking about how to do this properly. The one thing I do want to just spend 1 minute talking about is stopping rule. So this is something that we did that I haven't seen in a lot of social science experiments being done before. This is something that we borrowed from clinical trials, right? So if you're testing a vaccine and halfway through you realize oh, this is very successful, then you go and vaccinate everybody in the control group. Or if you see oh, this is actually very harmful to people, then you stop the experiment. So we pre-registered that. So we said, if while we're running the experiments, we detect that, for example, exposure to misinfo in our sample increases exponentially, then we stop the experiments, right? So we said we pre-registered that we would do this check on October 26th, which was roughly 2 weeks before the election. So we did these checks. We didn't find that there were any negative consequences. So we didn't stop the experiments, but that's something that we pre-registered that we would do, and we did this check. Okay. And I last couple of slides on the design of the project. I want to talk a little bit more broadly about the data that we collected. As I mentioned earlier, we have these survey responses for the set of participants that we recruited on platform, and then NRC helped us administer. But we also have other sorts of data that we use in the study. So one is individual level Facebook and Instagram log data. So these are things like how many posts people saw, classified by different content categories, engagement, different metrics related to usage of the products, which we use in the study to understand how the experiments affect the on-platform experience. And this is only for the people an individual level data is only for the people that consented to participate in the study. We also have, as I mentioned, aggregated Facebook and Instagram data for all monthly active Facebook and Instagram adult users during the election period, so during our study period. In addition, we also collected some additional data that we joined to this respondent level data. So we have public records for participants in the study, and this includes voter file data, so whether these people are registered to vote or not, and also whether they voted in the election. This is only in the states where legally permissible, and NORC collected all this data for us, and then they matched it to our main data set, and then they identified it. So we, meta researchers, academic researchers, we never had access to addresses of the people, things like that. And then for a subset of participants, we also have passive browser and app usage tracking. So what this means is that we ask them to install passive tracking software on their desktop devices or on their mobile phones in order to measure what websites they were visiting and what apps they were using. So this was a separate consent, something only in the order of 15% of people agreed to this. And this was also collected by NRC, de-identified and matched to the data set. And the reason why we collected this is that we can understand how people were using other platforms at the time of the study. So, and also when we run some of these experiments, we can use this data to, for example, identify substitution effects. So when people use Facebook less, are they using TikTok more, right? So that's the sort of things that I'll show you some evidence in a moment. Yeah, that's good.
Quick question about the sample. So you collected a lot of data from the Facebook and Instagram side as well as from NORC. Are these all from the same sample that you drew, or are these separate samples depending on the type of data or information that you were seeking?
Yeah, so this is for the whole for the main panel. So of up to 140,000 people. Some of this, with the exception of the aggregated data, which is for everybody in the US, but everything is for the same participants. It's just like some of these are not available for everybody. But otherwise, yes, and everything is joined. Yeah.
Just to make sure I understand. So the additional data, is it linked to the identity of the primary data? Or in other words, for a given Facebook user, you both know what kind of post does it post, and also you know
Yes.
like who does he vote for, or he or she vote
Yes,
for.
yes, from the survey data, yes. And we know if that person is registered to vote.
Okay.
Yes, yes. So this is obviously extremely sensitive data. So let me talk about how we ensure that we protected this, how we ensure that participants' privacy were protected. So all of the data was stored and analyzed in an isolated environment that we call the researcher platform. This is completely separate from Meta business servers, right? So what we did is all the data that came from the Meta side, so the log data, we uploaded it to this separate environment. And in a moment, I'll discuss how we ensure that we could then join it back to Meta servers. But what this means is it's quite important is that we collected all this data, but we can guarantee that the data will never be used for, let's say, advertising purposes or any other like purpose within the company because it never touched any Meta server. We also use this approach, so this is kind of like a clean room approach, because we were able to, so both the academic team and Meta researchers were able to access the data and the code, so that's how we did like the code review, and like anybody could analyze the data. So anybody could like write analysis code for the paper. All the personally identifiable information in the data was removed. NORC did this, right? So they, for example, to match with public records, they ask people for their address, like their full name, their date of birth. That's data that no one on the project ever had access to. They just like collected that, they matched it with publicly available records, and then they removed all of that except for the variables that we care about before joining it back to the rest. And then the other important thing here is that we use encrypted participant IDs in order to match across these data sources, right? So what this meant is that we had this like script that whenever we were like uploading from like Meta servers to this clean environment, the Facebook user ID or like Instagram user ID would be replaced to this unique participant ID, right? In such a way that we were not able to join it back to a Facebook user ID. And then earlier this year, we deleted the encryption key that allowed to join, so from user ID to participant ID. And like at that point, it's impossible for anybody to re-identify these people, right? And that was very scary thing to do because like, sometimes you're like, oh, I want to add this variable or something. We can no longer do that, right? But that was obviously very important to ensure that in the future, there's no way for us to like join it back to any Facebook data. So we deleted the encryption key. There's a lot more that went into this. So for example, for the aggregate data, we added a lot of like extra measures to ensure that it was not, or like to like minimize the risk that anyone could be re-identified based on this data. So for some metrics, we imposed anonymization. For example, for some of the web tracking data, we did that, winsorization, a bunch of different things. We haven't used differential privacy in this study yet because a lot of the data was so aggregated that it wasn't necessary, but that's also something that we explored as part of the project. And happy to talk more about this if you're interested during the Q&A. Yes.
Yeah. So about the voting data, you
Yes.
said it's mostly self-report, like users report.
So we have two types. So we have in the survey data, we ask people, who did you vote for? Did you vote in the election? Are you registered to vote? And a bunch of different things. And then we also have for states where this data set exists, we have data from the voter file. So this is public records where you have like name, address, and then whether this person is officially registered to vote and whether they voted on different elections. So like validated turnout data.
But the states data, you don't know who they vote for, right?
Correct, we don't know that.
So
Yes,
in
that's
this case, I was wondering, like, to what extent do you think they report their voting correctly? Like, do they have a tendency to report they vote for one person, but in reality, they vote for the
Yeah,
other?
so we have no way of like verifying vote choice. I think like what has been found in the literature, so this is a problem that's broader from this project, but like in political science, there's been some studies that look at this, like to what extent can you trust what people self-report? And like, no, like the things that you would expect is like what they found. So for example, people over-report that they voted in the election, things like that. I don't think it's because like the specific vote choice is generally secret pretty much everywhere. I don't think like people have verified that. But one thing that you can check is like the overall aggregate results and what you get in the survey, and then like based on that, with survey data, there's always a lot of noise. Yeah, that's why we went and collected this like additional data. Okay, so let me now talk about the results of two of the studies that we already published. So these are the platform interventions that I mentioned earlier that focuses specifically on, okay, what is the impact of a specific platform affordance on a set of outcomes that we care about in this project. And the two projects that I will present today, one is what we call in the like-minded demotion that has as like the main goal studying what is the impact of, well, first of all, like, are there echo chambers on Facebook? And two, what happens when you take people out of an echo chamber? Does that make them less polarized? And this is joint work with Brendan Nyhan, Jamie Settle, Emily Thorson, and Magdalena Wojcicka on the academic side, and I was the lead author on the meta side, which meant I was in charge of executing the research, supporting, writing of the paper, and all of that. And then the other paper, what we call in the chronofeed intervention, this is joint work with Andy Guest, Neil Malhotra, and Jennifer Pan on the academic side. I was also the lead researcher on the meta part of the project. And here we're trying to study the effect of feed ranking algorithms. So what happens when you turn off feed ranking? And I will describe what that is in a second. What does that mean in terms of like, are people becoming more or less polarized? How does that affect their levels of knowledge? Things like that. And first of all, like what is the impact of these algorithms in terms of like affecting what people see on Facebook or Instagram? And each of these, so basically we have like these like multiple treatment arms design where we had a control group that was joined across all of these interventions. And these were participants that, they went through the entire recruitment flow as anybody else, but we randomly assigned to being in the placebo group, which meant they were just like in the default experience on Facebook. So we did nothing, right? So they were seeing everything according to like regular algorithmic ranking. And then we have, so for these two studies, we have a treatment arm for each of them. So in the chrono feed, participants were assigned to see all content in their news feed on Facebook if they were on the Facebook side, or home feeds on Instagram in reverse chronological order. So this is something that you can test yourself. So this on Facebook, this is called the most recent feed. It's hidden somewhere in your options. And on Instagram, this is now called a following feed. And basically it's like you see the same content that you could see in rank feed, but it's just like the most recent content is like you see it first, right? So there's no algorithmic ordering in some sense. Although I guess like chronological order is algorithmic in a way, if we're being technical about it. But other than that, no. And then the second one is this like-minded demotion, where we took content that was shared from your like-minded friends, pages, and groups. So if you're liberal, any content from your like-minded friends or content from pages that have audiences that are like liberal, we would just demote it. So you would be less likely to see it on your feed. And this is kind of like a way of testing, like, what if we take you out of your echo chamber? If you're like conservative, like everything you see conservative leaning, what happens if you see less of that? Okay. So let me talk about each of these in turn. So the first one is a paper that was published in Nature. Why would we care about this to begin with? Why do we care about echo chamber? Something that I've done prior to my work at Meta. I've studied a lot. There's a lot of concern about how exposure to congenial information on social media could be exacerbating some of these issues of political sectarism and polarization in the US, but also in other countries. And there's a concern that social media might be amplifying some of these dynamics. When you look at the published literature, the evidence is mixed. So it is true that most people on social media are interacting mostly with other like-minded peers, but turns out that exposure to diverse views are more likely than people assume. So I think there's like papers like with like conflicting evidence in terms of like what is the impact of social media and political polarization. But we still have limited knowledge, both descriptive in terms of like, are people really in an echo chamber when they are on social media? And in this case, we're gonna focus specifically on Facebook, but also limited evidence that is like causal in nature. So what happens if you see less content from like-minded people? Are you going to become less polarized? So in this study, we try to fill this gap, both by releasing new descriptive data on some of these prevalence metrics to study this question, like is Facebook an echo chamber? and also causal analysis with this experiment that allow us to understand how reducing exposure to like-minded sources affects the information that users see on Facebook, and then also what happens with any subsequent impact on attitudes and behavior, like polarization, ideological consistency of your views, things like that. Okay. So as I mentioned in this study, let me talk about the research design. So here we use aggregate data, so we some of the aggregate data that I mentioned, and also we have respondent level data for the participants in the control group and the treatment arm that we use in this study. And I think like this is something that we discussed already. We look at what they were seeing on platform and like how they were engaging with content. One important thing in terms of the implementation is that we downranked all content from your like-minded connections on Facebook, right? This is important because we could have done just like demoting news and political information. So why didn't we choose that? Turns out, and this is based on research that one of my co-authors in this study has like a book specifically on like the polarizing or like potentially polarizing nature of social media. And she makes the point that a lot of this content that we may think, oh, it's not political, it actually still communicates political cues. For example, if you own an electric car and you shop at the farmer's market, you can make inferences about people's political leanings, and that also conveys, a political signal. So we may also want to capture that. And then the other thing, and we have statistics here to prove that, turns out politics and news is like very small percentage of everything that people see on social media. Maybe for those of us in this room that, potentially we might be more politically interested than the average person, that is not the case. But for most people, this is the case. In this study, we show that it's something in the order of like 7% or less of what people see, even during a very contentious period that happens to be politics or news. So if we were to just demote politics and news, what would happen is that the effect would be very diluted, it would be a very small impact. So we wanted to have this very big treatment that potentially could have large effects on people's experience. Yeah.
So to do this, you'd need a number or something of political polarization for sources that they would see. How would you?
Yes, so that's my next slide. So thank you.
Perfect, yeah.
Great segue. So how do we know? So we use a classifier that my team built prior to this project that estimates a political ideology for users in the US, US adults. And this is basically we assign a score from 0 to 1, from liberal to conservative. This is based on demographic data, engagement with content, connection to different sources, things like that. So we use this estimate for adult US users, their friends, and then for pages and groups, we don't develop an estimate of the page or group itself, we look at the audience. So this is something that has been used in other studies before. It turns out the average ideology score of people that follow a given page turns out to be a very good predictor of the source's ideology. So for example, if you're classified as left-leaning, we would demote content by your left-leaning friends as well as content by pages and groups that have a left-leaning audience. And in the paper, we do a lot of work to validate this. So we compare, for example, the ideology score for survey participants with what they self-report in surveys, and turns out this is highly accurate inference. Okay, yeah.
So why did you choose to downgrade rather than upgrade?
That's a very good question as well, because initially we wanted to boost content from cross-cutting sources, which I think was more closely related to what people would care about. But in consultation with this outside ethics firm, we decided not to do it mostly for ethical reasons, because there's been some studies showing that can backfire. So there was a study by Chris Bale, 2018 PNAS, that shows that exposure to cross-cutting content actually increases polarization.
Sure.
So we didn't want to have that sort of thing of increasing polarization, whereas reducing exposure to like-minded sources based on prior work, that's something that was more likely to actually reduce polarization. So that's why we do it. Inadvertently, as I'll show you in a few slides, we were boosting cross-cutting content as well, but that's why we designed this in the way that we did. Yeah. Okay, so what do we find? So let's start with the descriptive data. So this is a histogram of the percentage that people see. So for this aggregate data for adult monthly active users in the US on Facebook, this is of everything that you see, what percentage comes from like-minded sources, right? So what we learn from here is that most content that users see on Facebook, so around 50%, right, is from ideologically like-minded sources, right? So this kind of like confirms that yes, like most people are in like some sort of like small echo chambers, if you want. Something in the order of 15% only comes from cross-cutting sources. The rest in the middle is from content that is either moderate, like users who are moderate, or like sources with ideologically mixed audiences. So while this is true, we also found that extreme echo chambers are relatively infrequent. So this part here of like people that are only connected to like-minded sources is relatively small. At least, again, like small or large depends on your prior. But we found here, like what we report, something in the order of like 20% of Facebook users get over 75% or more of their exposures from like-minded sources. Yeah.
And what's the share of those 20% users in terms of the posts that are produced?
That's a good, so I don't know that, but that's a good point. I would expect like probably like those people would be more active than average. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. This is all like from like the viewer side, so this is like from what people see. But yeah, that's a good point. This is the same graph, but looking at cross-cutting sources. As you can see here, like there's like most of the mass of this distribution is like towards zero, because it's just like less. Like exposure to content from cross-cutting sources is relatively infrequent. It's something in the order of 32% of users that get over 25% of their exposures from cross-cutting sources. And these patterns are similar when we look at politics or like news content. And also we looked at like the most active users, those that like logged onto Facebook every day during our study period, and like these patterns like look actually quite similar. Okay, so these are the scripted statistics. In the paper, there's much more. There's like a 400-page appendix where we report a lot of different things about this like idea of like echo chambers on Facebook. One of the things that is interesting that is not reported in the main text of the paper, we also look at networks. So we look at what is the median proportion of connections, like of friends for Facebook users, who's like, so like what is the average proportion of your friends that are like-minded? So when we look at these results of exposure, like a lot of it is like, of course, driven by what your network looks like, right? So I think like that's an important thing to have in mind here as well. Okay. So the experiment, what do we find? So this is just like a manipulation check looking at how exposure to like-minded sources goes down for the treatment group during the study period. So, prior to the treatment, because we randomized correctly, is like basically the same. And we see this big drop, which is in the order of like, 35%, right? And this is flip side, so exposure to cross-cutting sources. So as I explained earlier, we also see there's an increase in cross-cutting sources for the treatment group, although it's like smaller in magnitude, because there's this like third category of like things in the middle, okay? Why doesn't this go down to zero? Well, because it's a demotion, but also because the even like potential strength of this treatment is constrained by your own connections, right? So in this graph here, let's just focus on this panel. This is based on like your proportion of exposure to like-minded sources prior to the experiment, right? And this is for the treatment and control, like how that changed. And you can see that if you are not connected to any like-minded sources, so you're here, the effect is tiny. Why? Because there's nothing to demote. If everything you see is like-minded, the effect is also smaller because there's nothing to replace. So, right? So it's like, we see like the effect is like largest in the middle. In the paper, we do a lot of work also on like looking at heterogeneous treatment effect analysis here to understand like, are the effects like different from the subset? Turns out like they're like this in practice, like, because we have, sneak pre, like, just like spoiler alert, we have no effects on a lot of like pretty much all of the survey outcomes that we look at. The effect doesn't vary that much. So this turned out not to matter. Okay, so let me just go to the results. Actually, I'm going to skip this since it's less important, and let me focus on this one. So these are the effects on engagement, because I think it's like pretty interesting pattern that we see here. So we look at engagement with content on Facebook in two different ways. So we look at total engagement, so the total number of actions. We split that into passive and active engagement, depending on kind of like the threshold for that engagement to take place. And then we have engagement rates where we normalize these counts by how frequently people see different types of content. And what we see, let me focus your attention on these ones here, is that overall engagement with like-minded sources went down. Part of this is like an artifact of people seeing less like-minded content. But the interesting thing is that engagement rates actually went up. So people were seeing less content from like-minded sources, but they were more likely to like it and reshare it and things like that. I think like that's like an interesting result. There's thinking like implications of this work, like you may want to take people out of the echo chamber, but people exhibit this behavioral preference for congenial content, right? Like they might see less of it, but they seem to express a demand for some of this content. And I think like thinking about like implications for design is like, yeah, like maybe people tell you, oh, I want to see less of this content, but when you look at what they do, it turns out they exhibit this preference. For cross-cutting sources is the other way around. So we see, again, it went up, the total engagement rate, the total engagement count, but the rate went down a little bit because even if you were feeding them these veggies, they were like, no, we don't want veggies. We just want a like-minded content. So yeah. Okay, and then attitudinal outcomes. So these are the things that we pre-registered as like the survey attitudes and behaviors that we wanted to see if our experiment would affect. So polarization, different ways of measuring this, as well as different beliefs about the electoral system and like, respect for election norms and things like that. Across the board, using the pre-register estimation method that we said that we would do, we find pretty precisely estimated results near zero. So these are like, again, like small in magnitude, and we do some equivalence tests in the paper, and like we see that we're able to like reject the null hypothesis that this had like large effects on people. So I guess we're like close to zero here. And across a range of secondary outcomes that we tested as well, we also found that none of those crossed the pre-register threshold for significance. So it seems that despite these large changes on people's own platform experiences, that didn't actually, like, for example, reduce political polarization. In the paper, as I mentioned, we have a long appendix where we do a lot of HTE analysis, but across the board, we also find that these effects were similar for different subgroups of people. Okay, so let me take, how much more time? Can I take another 8 minutes?
Yeah, 8.
Okay. So let me briefly talk about the second study that we published. Is like what I'm calling the chronofeed paper, was published in Science. This is related, but looks at the slightly different angle of potential mechanisms by which social media might be exacerbating some of these societal issues like polarization and inequalities, which is the impact of feed ranking algorithms, right? And just like as in this echo chamber idea, this has been difficult to study because it's very difficult to manipulate how feed ranking algorithms work unless you come up with like one of these like sorts of collaborations, which is what we did here. So here we tested this treatment, and then we also look at how turning off the algorithm affects like people's experiences on platform, and whether that has any subsequent impact on their attitudes and behaviors. Okay, so this is the treatment, and let me just like show you some of the results of what we found here. First, starting with time spent on platform. So these graphs are somewhat complex to read, but let me try to walk you through it. So this is actually a lot of like small dots. So imagine each of these is a participant sorted from like lowest to highest on the y-axis. The y-axis is the difference between each participant and how much time the average monthly active person spends on Facebook. The reason why we had to do this and not just minutes is that we couldn't report exactly minutes for like legal reasons. So we compare each participant. So someone that is here, it means like the same time spent as the average like monthly active user on Facebook. And the colors indicate whether someone is in the default experience participants. You can see like most participants spend more time on Facebook than the average person on Facebook. Why? Because our participants were more likely to be active on the platform for different reasons. And the difference between these two lines is the effect of our treatment. And what we see here is that, particularly for Facebook, switching people from the default algorithmic experience to chronological feed had a huge impact on people's time spent. So this is something that they're the order of 25 to 30% less time spent on Facebook, which is huge. It's a huge effect, right? On Instagram, we see also a decrease, but it's like smaller in magnitude, but still like pretty large, right? So this is like the main thing that is like an important result is that perhaps unsurprisingly, because these algorithms are optimized to maximize time spent on platform, then we see like when you take people out of these like algorithmic surfaces, they spend less time on Facebook. We also see a large decrease on engagement with content. So this is also normalized by exposure to content. People are less likely to like and less likely to comment on the content that they see on this chronological feed treatment group compared to the normal feed. And we see the same both on Instagram and Facebook. So behaviorally, there's more engagement in this algorithmic experience. Again, perhaps unsurprising. And finally, we also looked at the different sources of exposure. So one of the main changes that we detect as usage from the algorithmic feed to the chronological feed is that people are more likely to see content from groups and pages as compared to friends, right? And again, I think this is perhaps unsurprising because a lot of these ranking algorithms are designed to show you more content from the people that you are likely to care about, which is likely to be, your friends and family, as opposed to, pages and groups that you're connected to. On Instagram, we operationalize this as your mutual follows. So those are people that you follow and then they follow you back, like unidirectional follows and then unconnected sources, right? And we also see similar changes there. And the last thing that I will show you in terms of effects on platform experience is changes in the mix of content that people saw, starting with politics and political news. Turns out when you turn off the algorithm, you see much more content that is politics and news as well. Right. Again, perhaps this is driven by, let's say, pages and groups are more likely to produce content, more political content. You see more of those from those sources. You also see an increase in exposure to sources with ideologically mixed audiences, which I think is interesting because what this is telling us is that feed ranking is more likely to show you content from both your like-minded connection and your cross-cutting connections. It's kind of like a complicated story, but it's basically showing you content that is like more likely to be like not in the middle of kind of like the ideological spectrum. So this has like in some way unexpected implications for this echo chamber idea, because it's not necessarily putting you into an echo chamber. It's like in some ways like increasing like the amount of content from these like two sides that you see. Finally, we see that there's an increase in exposure to untrustworthy sources. So these are people that are more likely to be sharing misinformation, right? So in ChronoFeed, again, perhaps because like feed ranking is already trying to like, implement some efforts to reduce the distribution of misinformation. So as you take people out from that, you're seeing like more content from some of these these sources that repeatedly share misinformation. We also looked at instability and like exposure to content with slurwords. The effects here, like these are like relatively like small prevalence, so like the effects here are like less meaningful, but we also see some impact there. But then yet again, in like when it comes to like survey attitudes and behaviors, self-reported behaviors, for the most part, we don't see that this impact, this treatment had any large say a statistically significant impact on these things that we pre-register as the main hypothesis. There's two exceptions here, and both happen to be outcomes that are like measured on platform and not from the survey. So one is there's a decrease in engagement with political content on platform. Again, perhaps unsurprising because it's like normalized by exposure. If you see more politics, but it's like less relevant to you, your engagement rates go down. And we also see an increase in clicks on partisan news sources, which again could be explained by these changes in like seeing more content from like, sources that are like both sides of the ideological spectrum. But overall, it doesn't seem that this affected political polarization, knowledge, things like that, okay? The one thing that I will say, and there's like one last result, and then I'll move to conclusions, is that we do see that there were some substitution effects here, and this makes the story more complicated. But for example, when people were saying spending less time on Instagram, they were spending more time on TikTok. On Facebook, they were replacing it with, for example, Reddit and YouTube, right? So in some ways, like one of the limitations of the experiment is that we don't have full control over everything that people did. So if they were replacing this like algorithmically served content with algorithmically served content from other platforms, like we have no way of controlling that. Okay, so what do we learn from these two studies, and what are like the lessons like moving forward for this project? First is that I think like we want to be very upfront about the limitations of these experiments, right? And we were very lucky to have these like large samples and like the ability to like manipulate these features, but at the same time, there's a lot that we could not do. So Facebook is only representing a small part of all the political news content that people see. maybe 3 months, which is for like, the length of period for which we run this experiment, maybe 3 months is not enough to change attitudes and behavior, right? So we can only speak about what is the effect of like this like 3-month, switch off of the algorithm. And of course, in the context of an election, it might be even more difficult to move people's attitudes. These interventions don't speak about general equilibrium effects, so they don't speak about the whole aggregate effect of the algorithm. This is just like a partial equilibrium effect, like what happens if you turn out the algorithm for one specific person, right? And then other things, but like most important is like this may not generalize to other platforms, elections, and countries, and of course I hope that more of these experiments can take place in other contexts. But I think there's like some like important conclusions here, and like I will leave you with these 3 things. So one is, I think there's like this like very perhaps legitimate concern about echo chambers and feed tracking algorithms, but like basically these results suggest that perhaps these concerns have been exaggerated, and some of these like worst fears of like just like a short period exposure to like algorithmic ranking can like further polarize you. Like that's not warranted by the data and the results that we show here. Second, despite that, these algorithms have important effects, right? So maybe they don't affect your attitudes and behavior, but they do have very large effects on your own platform experience. Maybe they cannot counteract fully your proclivity to prefer congenial information, as I show you in this like-minded source experiment, but they do have a lot of impact. So I think it's very important to continue studying how they work and how they affect people's experiences. Finally, we had this like hope that some of these solutions might actually show you that this works, and this is like a solution or like a silver bullet to address some of these potential societal issues. We didn't find that in this study, right? So we didn't find that this actually helped. So that's like disappointing in some ways. But that's all we find. So I'm gonna leave it here. There's more papers coming out soon, so they will have more lessons in the future. But yeah, happy to take more questions, and thanks so much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting talk. My question is, don't you think that it is a bit crucial to like the period that you have been monitoring and conducting experiment? Because I believe that probably like in this period of time, you would expect to have very like polarized political opinion and like very much echo chambers. So probably the effect of the world on the behavior on Facebook is like I don't know, predominant.
Yeah, so I think it's yes. So that's something. Yeah. So let me yes, a few things. One is if the things like in the study, we wanted to study the impact around the election periods. In some ways, we were like constrained to like we had to run it during this study. I would also add that there's been like many other election studies before, like running other like digital field experiments that did show like significant effects on people's attitudes and behavior. Just to give you an example, during the same study period, there was a paper, a study that did like a Fox News deactivation, where like there's a work by David Brockman and Josh Kalla. They basically asked people to switch from Fox News to CNN, and they compensated for that. And they did find that change like reduced affective polarization, right? So I think like even in the context of an election, I think there are things that you could do that can have an impact on people. So I think like if you benchmark against that, I think like and here like I think like these like null effects are meaningful, but I do agree that if we were to run this, let's say now, as opposed to 2020, we would probably find different things. The platforms are also changing, right? So for example, like today on Facebook, a lot of content that you see comes from recommendations, which is something that didn't happen in 2020. So I think like the impact of feed ranking is probably bigger when like a lot of it comes from this like recommendation algorithm that we didn't even like explore because it wasn't a thing back in 2020. So yeah, I think like my answer would be we need more research to continue studying this. Yeah.
So I have I wonder what your thoughts are on the mechanism of pluralistic ignorance.
Uh-huh.
So it's clear that people are with the normal algorithm, people are seeing content that are more aligned with their own beliefs, right? And this can be either somebody on the left, in the middle, or on the right. But because of this algorithm, people might believe that there's more extremism than there actually is. Just right, and that could, and they believe that everybody is sort of extreme and polarized in this way.
Yeah.
Could that sort of have indirect effects in terms of political processes or other outcomes, political outcomes?
Yeah, so so we in a different paper in this like first batch, the paper that looked at ideological segregation in news exposure, that's kind of like what we like from a descriptive point of view, what we were like trying to explore, right? Because we were looking at whether these audiences, so compared to the network structure on this was like on Facebook only, and like who is sharing political news, is it the case that after feed ranking you're more likely to see content that is aligned, like news content that is aligned with your political ideology, and whether that leads to like different like bubbles of like news consumption? Like we did find evidence in support of that, because like feed rank is like increasing these bubbles a little bit. I think like, but at the same time, I think like in this like-minded sources experiment, it's different in some way because we're like demoting all content, right? But we, and it's not directly testing this like mechanism that you're like alluding to of like simply like loudest, more extreme voices like being amplified more. But in this case, like we don't find that change like necessarily led to any like subsequent impact on political attitudes and behavior. I think like that's something that hopefully future experiments can test more directly. But we do see evidence that the mechanism, like this thing is like happening in this other study. Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting that people, just to kind of set up my question, that people's behavioral preference for like-minded sources like persisted.
Yeah.
Even when you demoted that content. Did you look at all at what cross-cutting features of cross-cutting posts or messages led people to engage with it? Because for like-minded, you might expect like, oh, they want to feel good about themselves, like all these sort of cognitive processes, but what would cause people to sort of go out of their way to interact with? Yeah.
That's a good question. So in the appendix, we didn't look at like specific like content that was kind of like due to like privacy reasons. We didn't look at specific content like that people were engaging with and things like that. But we did in the appendix, we do report results split by topic. So we have like a topic classifier, and we have like 26 topics, things like both politics, but also like fashion and architecture and business. I don't remember like what the results show, but we have a little bit of evidence of that in the appendix that could be used to answer that question. I think like that's interesting. I think like, yeah, I guess we're just looking at the top line results, and like we didn't think about that. We also have these results split by whether the content is coming from a friend or a page that you follow or a group you're a member of. I'm trying to remember what we find, but I can't remember right now. But it's in the appendix, so I will look at it and then like get back to you.
Yeah,
later.
I will too.
Yeah, but that's a very good question. Yeah, thank you.
And I have one more. So something that I think I've seen in my research, and I know you have a paper on this, is like how political users differ from non-political users. So did you find like there to be a distinction between a group of users who like are actively engaged with politics versus aren't, and then they reacted differently to the different interventions?
Yeah. So first of all, I think like let me start by giving some context, which is one of the things that I was surprised about like in these studies is that turns out like the proportion of people. So first of all, the proportion of content that people see that is politics on Facebook turns out to be much lower than I expected. On Instagram, it's even lower. And then perhaps because of that, the number of users that actually are politically active on Facebook is surprisingly small. For one of these other studies, we pre-registered that we would look at, so like split by quote unquote levels of engagement. With politics, we would look at the top 1%, the top 20%, and like everybody else. We had to change that because the top 20%, like already like the threshold was already 0 engagement. So we had to eventually only look at 10%, right? So it's only basically 10% of people that ever engage with political content, right? So that's the one thing I was like, wow, like this is very concentrated on a small number of people. At the same time, so in some of these, I'll go back, some of the HT analysis that we look at, so we have strength of ideology. I don't think we have like level of engagement here, but we didn't find that the results vary by the strength, like likely measures of political interest, which is, so like a proportion of civic views, right? So all of these are like not significant. So this is effect of the like-minded attraction, effective polarization. But in the other study that I haven't presented here that looks at segregation and news consumption, we did see that this like top 1% was driving a lot of like the segregation of platforms. So once you look at everybody else, people are not particularly segregated, it's just like this like top 1%. So I think like in the future, that's the other like lesson for me is like thinking about the impact of platforms. It's important to think about this like denominators or like what is the proportion of people that actually you're like looking at metrics for, right? Because it's very small. So I think like future, we have another study that will look at impacts of exposure to misinformation. And one of the things that we did there was we oversampled. So there was like a simple different sampling process, and we oversample the top 1% of people that were most exposed to misinformation to try to get at precisely some of these like asymmetries. So we'll have more evidence on that in the future paper of how that matters.
Yeah, that's interesting. Cool. All right, well, thank you so much.